speakers of the series are current fellows of the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at Penn. And each year the Katz Center has approximately 20 fellows that they bring in to work on research related to a similar topic. This year the topic is Jews, Commerce, and Culture. And as you can imagine, that topic is of natural interest to the Wharton School, and we welcome the partnership that we have with the Katz Center on this topic. Hopefully the series will help us topple some myths with regard to the roles of Jews in business and evaluate some troubling stereotypes, as well as get a feeling for the roles that Jews have played in international commerce. David Ruderman last week gave an overview to the series, and I'm not going to repeat that. But suffice it to say that we hope that as a result of the three-part lecture series you have, that you're going to enjoy the exchange of ideas and have a more robust understanding of Jewish history and the role it's played in business history as well. I think last week, Jonathan Karp is here, gave a talk. Jonathan's a professor at SUNY Binghamton, gave an overview on the modern role of Jews in modern business. Today, Evelyne is going to talk about the role in Western Europe, and next week we have Adam Teller from Haifa, who's going to be talking about the role in Europe, Eastern Europe. So now let me tell you a little bit about Professor Evelyne Oliel-Grausz. I hope I did sort of okay. I grew up in Southern Ohio, so these things are hard for me. She has a doctorate in modern European history from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and she got her doctorate in 2000. After that, she spent 4 years at the University of Lyon. Upon that, she returned to her alma mater at Sorbonne, where now she's a faculty member in the area of early modern and modern Jewish history. She's co-edited a book on Jews in the French Revolution, and she's working on a book right now on Sephardic trade networks in Western Europe in the 18th century. She has 20 published chapters or articles covering a wide range of topics, including things on ethnicity, cultural identity, Sephardic diaspora, I'm trouble with that, and Jewish leadership. This year, of course, she has a Primo Levi fellowship at the Katz Center, and she's studying the relation between culture and economic history in the early and modern Sephardic diaspora. She is one of the leading scholars on Northern European Sephardic Jews, and her work details how people and ideas and goods circulated among Sephardic families based in Amsterdam and other Western European locations. She is credited with identifying two little known collections of merchant letters that was discovered at the Municipal Archives in Amsterdam. And that's helped understand the relationship between the exchange in France and Suriname. And she used these letters to figure out how Sephardic merchants built economic alliances with kin, co-religious, and non-Jews as well. So, based on that, let me welcome her to the podium, and she's going to deliver a lecture on Kinship, Commerce, and Trade Networks, early modern Sephardic
Otherwise, you won't even see me, so.
Modern
it's
technology.
spoken on the radio. So thank you. Well, I want to thank the Wharton School of Economics for inviting me to give this talk today, and David Ruderman and the Katz Center as well. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming despite the sleet and the lousy weather. I'm very honored. I shall start this lecture with a very modest story. A story found by chance, almost stolen, from the daily life of the Sephardim involved in commerce we are going to talk about today. First of all, a few words, very few words about this Sephardic diaspora. In the 18th century, about which I will be mostly talking, the Sephardic diaspora extends from Smyrna, Eastern Mediterranean, today's Turkey, to Paramaribo in the Dutch Guianas, with offshoots as far as India. Since the end of the 16th century, former New Christians have established or re-established settlement in Northern and Western Europe, Hamburg, Amsterdam, London, southwestern France, where religious ambiguity was still prevalent until the end of the 17th century, and farther west in the Caribbean and Northern America. So when I use the word Sephardi, I will refer to those Portuguese Jews, and will use New Christians or conversos for those remaining in Iberian lands, or when referring to situations of religious ambiguity. That's for vocabulary. The story I want to tell you about takes place on the Dutch island of Curaçao in the Caribbean in 1758, and involves not a wealthy colonial merchant, but an ordinary young man called David de Selomo de Lima. So there is a handout. Yes, you can't hear. I have a microphone. It should be loud enough. Should I turn it up? No.
Yes. Yes, please.
How do I do this? I thought this one was doing the trick.
That's better.
Oh, all right. It's better?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So this story I want to tell you about involves this young man, David de Lima. And as I said, you have seen these names. Most of the time are not very well known, and so that you identify them, you have this handout with those various names, some of which are well known and others totally unknown to you, and even to me until a short time until I discovered these letters. So this guy, David de Lima, he's a young man apparently struggling for a living. Now the chances that we might have known about him and about his existence would have been non-existent were it not for the fact that the ship on which his letter was sent from Curaçao to his parents in Amsterdam was seized by the British fleet, confiscated, its contents meticulously listed by the English High Court of Admiralty. And so if his letter never reached his parents, thanks to that mishap and to the 7-Year War, we know precisely, thanks to that price, what was on board the ship, the merchandise, silver bullions, dollars, and all the expected colonial staples, sugar, brown sugar, white sugar, coffee, indigo, cacao, hides. Indigo is the dye stuff, the most common dye stuff that was exported from the Caribbean to Europe. So all the traditional colonial staple that made that colonial trade. We know who sent what merchandise to whom, and among this inventory, the goods that were on the ship, and also on that ship were a number of bundles of letters, and it's among those letters sent from locals, inhabitants of Curaçao to Amsterdam, that I found a big box of letters sent by Curaçaoan Jews to Amsterdam. So most of these Sephardi letters, most of these letters sent by Jews, first of all, they're written by Sephardi, except for one. It's written in Yiddish to an Ashkenaz partner in Amsterdam. Most of them deal with business, trade, consignment, shipment of colonial product to their Amsterdam partners and commissioners. And it is in one of those letters that we learn about our ordinary David de Lima. So what's his story? It's very ordinary, you see. From his very affectionate letter to his parents, we gather that he has not succeeded much in making a living in this colonial trade. And he feels all the more guilty because he wishes he could help his parents in Amsterdam, who seem to be in a slightly better situation than he is, but not much better off. So either business has gone wrong, Or he may even be one of those poor Sephardim that was shipped from Amsterdam or from another place to the New World by his community in hope of betterment, of economic betterment for him, and in order to alleviate the local burden of the poor in its original community. That's a possibility. At any rate, he tells his parents that because he cannot make a living in Curaçao, he's decided to leave the island for Jamaica after Passover, and that they should stop writing him until he gets there and he gets a new address, and he will tell them where to write. Now, Jamaica was under British rule, as you know, but there was an intense circulation of people, goods, legal and illegal, mostly illegal, between the various Caribbean islands in which Jews played a distinctive part. David then starts telling his parents about a chance encounter he made on the island of someone named Luzada. He doesn't even give his first name, another Portuguese Jew, and goes about narrating their exchange. This Luzada told him that they were related, and David was happy about it, and expected actually to get some help from the guy, and he was disappointed because, as I said, he expected that statement, "we're family," to be followed by a present or help of some form, and he said no, nothing followed that statement. And he said, well, we'll talk, we'll see each other soon, we'll talk, the Luzada guy tells him. So they meet again sometime later, and this Luzada fellow tells him that he wrote to David's parents in Amsterdam, asking them whether they could send him a bit of some merchandise to him and to his son, so that they could do some trade in Curaçao, and also asking the father whether David could marry his daughter. The young David is absolutely furious that this Luzada guy has taken the liberty to write his father to ask such things from him. And he tells him that he himself, first of all, has no intention of remaining on the island, and that if he had wanted to ask his father for goods to be sent so that he could do some trading with them, he would have asked him for him alone, and not for this Luzada guy, and that his father would never marry him off like that. So, in his letter to his parents, he asked his father to send a very stern reply to this Luzada guy, and he let his father know that this guy is very disreputable and that he owes money to everybody. He then proceeds to send regards to a number of people, his family, his neighbors, the Chacham, the Rabbi, one of the Amsterdam rabbi, David Israel Atias, and he also, in the process, gives a few information about a number of Dutch ships that have been seized while smuggling merchandise to the French West Indies. So now you will say, why did she choose that uninteresting letter, apparently trivial, and uninteresting situation? Well, I think a few things may be derived from that ordinary situation. First, the case runs counter the usual association between Sephardi Jews and prosperous traders, merchant, planter, you name it. This one is definitely left out of the colonial riches, and I would say closer to rags than to riches. It's also interesting because of the implicit values we can infer from this discourse and these actions. The primary assumption made by this Luzada fellow is that they are family, so Luzada assumes that they're going to do business together and tries to foster a marriage between David and his daughter. So based upon that kinship, he takes it upon himself to write to David's father. Now, none of the above-mentioned characters have much financial capacities or direct business connection. But the plan, as Luzada has it, is to ask another major Sephardi colonial trader in Amsterdam, Oliel de Castro, to take care of the merchandise that the father is going to send, because the family in Amsterdam obviously doesn't have much money. So he said, your father is going to consign merchandise to this Oliel de Castro, and he's going to ship it to us so that we can sell it and make a bit of money. So the pattern here that we have is of an existing solid commercial network, here servicing the less economic efficient, the less affluent, for transmitting commodities but also mail. The request that this Luzada guy is formulating is really a request for help, but not in the form of money, more in the form of commodities to trade with, a sort of mercantile charity, as it were. So David wants his father not to engage into business with this Luzada, whose credit rating, as he says, and reputation are very bad indeed. Through this trivial example, we encounter here a very important idea, that contradicts the implicit cliché of trust between business partners because they belong to the same ethnic group or because they belong to the same family. Here we see that the assessment of the risk risk, well, the risk associated with credit is more important than kin or even ethnic belonging. Okay. David has no money, but he's got friends, he's got connections, as his letter shows. And it's these very connections that make the association with him desirable, it seems. That one makes it into a desirable partner or even a desirable son-in-law in the present situation. Above all, this episode conveys a larger picture of the connection network in the Sephardi diaspora, here limited to a triangle, Curaçao, Jamaica, Amsterdam, and also London, because that's where the ship ends up with its cargo. And what do we see in this elementary picture? Economic endeavors, circulation of men, merchandise, family, business information, political information. So here we have it in this very ordinary example: rich and poor, kinship and commerce, colonial trade networks, and its side social benefits for the whole group, the risks encountered in times of war, a large number of central issues dealing with the Jews, commerce, myth, and reality that I will address now along several lines of questioning. First, I will go back, as a continuation of Jonathan Carm's presentation of last week, to the systematic association of Jews with commerce that permeates early modern economic and non-economic literature. Question the Jewish contribution to this representation and the vastly diverse social reality that it brings together that is brought together under the idea and the word of commerce. What does exactly commerce mean? It refers to a various, I will briefly show, diverse social reality. Then I will try to define through a number of examples what characterizes these Sephardi networks and how they are different from other minority or merchant networks. And lastly, I will also quite briefly show how these merchant networks cannot be isolated from a more global approach of circulation and communication within the Jewish world, of which they are but one aspect, even if it's the most commonly emphasized. Okay, so first, Jews and commerce. The systematic association of both terms, of which Jonathan Carr gave us some understanding going back to the Middle Ages, works as a double-edged sword. Either it may be used to extol the economic utility of the Jews among the nations, or on the contrary, to accuse them of a variety of crimes, from dishonesty to conspiring for the ruin of the host nations amidst which they dwell. If we look at a very well-known text, the article Juif, Jew, in the Encyclopédie, monumental publication of French Enlightenment, orchestrated by Diderot and D'Alembert, it is an excellent illustration of that first approach, Jews, commerce, utility. It is mostly devoted to the issue of commerce and the benefits that accrued from Jewish presence and commercial know-how. They are credited for the invention of the bill of exchange, another fascinating myth. And my friend, Professor Francesca Trivellato, is now preparing a book on that question, and the positive economic contribution and utility of the Jews. After medieval persecution, princes, says the author of the article, who's the Chevalier de Jaucourt, became aware that it was in their own interest to treat the Jews more kindly and that they could not be dispensed with anymore. Tuscany, Holland, England granted them a favorable status and protection. Since then, like the Chevalier de Jaucourt, they have become the instruments through which faraway nations may converse and correspond. The metaphor that he uses to convey the crucial role of the Jews in commerce is the following. They are like the pegs and nails used for a large construction and are necessary to assemble its various parts. The Jews then hold together the edifice of international commerce that would therefore be dismantled if they were to disappear. As well, what is meant here by Jews, by default I would say, is obviously and implicitly the Sephardi diaspora, since the same text continues with saying that after Spain, that Spain's demise is partly due to their expulsion, of the Jews. Now, Chevalier de Jaucourt did not really invent all this. It's more a potpourri, pardon my French, of various texts including a piece of Voltaire, and also the metaphor of the pegs and nails. It's actually taken from a British essayist and journalist, Addison, was published in The Spectator at the beginning of the 18th century. So it's not new. On the contrary, it really takes a number of elements in previous texts. And if we try to track back this tradition, well, so we go back to England, said pegs and nails. John Toland, his book Reasons for Naturalizing the Jews, published in 1714, which is itself very closely inspired by the fundamental book that Jonathan Karp discussed last week, the discourse written by the Venetian rabbi Simone Luzzatto. Okay, my point here is that this tradition, by going back to Luzzatto, owes a lot to Jewish utilitarian self-representation, as it appears in this fundamental work. Everybody plagiarizes Luzzatto, Jews and non-Jews, including Menashe ben Israel, the Amsterdam rabbi that is well known for his embassy to Cromwell for the readmission of the Jews to England and for his contact with Christian scholars. Menashe ben Israel, when he does not advocate millenarian arguments for the readmission of the Jews to England, uses Luzzatto's argument about the utility of the Jews for commerce, even though he admits that he is himself a man of learning and he doesn't know much about commerce. In a letter that he writes to Cromwell in garbled French, he even in which he suggests guidelines for readmission, he even proposes a form of screening for potential Jewish immigrants that would ensure their utility, that is to say, eliminate poor and undesirable immigrants. So this association, this association between prosperous trader, utility, has always also been promoted by Jewish self-representation. Now this is one trend. The second trend is the mechanical association. The other trend of association with Jews and commerce, which is much less favorable, much less ingratiatory. I will quote here very briefly only an anonymous text written by a Frenchman at the end of the 17th century in an English translation, in which he depicts a very interesting picture on what goes on behind the stage of speculation in Amsterdam. And it is we discussed another similar text by Quevedo this afternoon in our seminar, so this is a continuation also of a dialogue we had with the other fellows. This Judaic sect, says this anonymous French writer, these Jews are numerous and substantial in Amsterdam and maintain a very intimate relationship with members of the government, Jewish influence. Because they are as concerned with news as with commerce, they are so far superior in both that on big occasions they succeed in making their suppositions prevail over the truth. In both news and commerce, they maintain relations with their sister congregations, as they call them. The one in Venice, though less wealthy and less populous, is nonetheless reckoned the first among the major congregations because it links the west to the east and the south via the congregation of Salonika, which governs their nation in these two other parts of the world. Correspondingly, the Venice congregation, with the Amsterdam one, governs all communities of the north. In these two regards, in commerce and news, one might say that they are the first and best informed about all that moves in the world. With that information, they construct their scheme every week in their meetings, which they hold very appropriately the day after Saturday, their Sabbath, and consequently the day before Monday, Sunday, when the Christians of all the sects devote themselves to their religious exercises. These schemes, which consist of the subtlest news they have received that week, refined by their rabbis and congregational leaders, these schemes are on Sunday afternoon issued to their Jewish brokers and agents, the most adroit men in the world in this field, who have made another agreement among themselves and go separately from that day and spread the news fitted to their aims. Monday morning, according to the dispositions of the various detailed aspect, purchase, sell, change, and stocks, in all which genres, having always amongst them substantial amounts at hand or readily available, they are instructed to make a move actively, passively, or both ways at the same time. So, this text, why did I read this text? Because the picture that emerges here, beyond the idea of Jewish domination through this kind of global and interconnected capitalism, is one that, despite the critic, recognizes the skill and expertise of the Jews, particularly as brokers and agents. And Also, an explanation that explains their success by the mastery of their information and by the interconnectedness of their communities, and identifies these communities as the real economy actors. And I will come back later on to that idea, the role, potential of communities. Sometimes these two approaches coexist, coalesce, I could say, as in the Dictionnaire universel du commerce, Universal Dictionary of Commerce by Savary, which is an absolute classic in merchant literature, in which, in his article, Juif, Savary says that Jews are known for their skill in commerce, but their commercial practice is also suspected of not always being as honest, as trustworthy as possible. So, skillful, dishonest, both approaches together. So, what comes out from this representation? I would say two main ideas. First, the implicit equation between merchant, Jew, and commerce. Then the idea that the Jews connect the world of commerce as pegs and nails, as vectors of information. Undoubtedly, these associations are greatly influenced by the historical experience of the Portuguese Jews, largely identified with the merchant diaspora, and by the contribution of Sephardic Jews themselves to the elaboration of this system of representation. Representation, self-representation of Jews myth, what does the social reality of these communities tell us about their involvement in commerce? In his study on merchant Jews in the 17th century, Daniel Swieczynski says that approximately 80% of Amsterdam Portuguese Jews were more or less directly engaged in commerce, 80%. Now, commerce, as simple as it may sound, is deceptively simple. It covers a wide range of activities connected with the exchange of goods and credits. At the top, at the pyramid, the financiers that combine state finance with international trade, whether they do so like the financiers in Spain, conversos, or as Jews in countries where they had settled since the end of the 16th century, like such figures as the Lopez Suazo family in Holland, who financed, Antonio Lopez Suazo financed the military campaigns of the Prince of Orange, who was to become King of England in 1689, or like David Gradis in 18th century Bordeaux, who was involved at the same time in colonial trade with the French West Indies, and who was an important army purveyor and banker for the French king during the 7 Years' War. So, financiers and very important traders. Then come the merchants, which often acted also as bankers. It's very difficult to separate trade from credit, and more so as the preceding time, very often on a modest scale. Then brokers and commissioners. Very often, though, all these roles overlapped, and merchants acted as commissioners as well. At the end of the scale, very schematic scale, retailers and peddlers. Studies on Portuguese trade in Spanish Americas have shown instances of vertical integration connecting the peddler that sells his wares in the streets of Lima, Peru, to the merchant and financiers in Seville and Lisbon through local colonial partners and wholesalers. Now, the history of these bankers, brokers, merchants is often presented through examples of successful merchant houses, particularly for those engaged in colonial trade, where the returns could be very high. But these various forms of business were also risky business, and that is what I want to emphasize here. And tales of downward mobility and dissension compete with tales of upward mobility. Risks naturally vary according to numerous economic and non-economic factors. As you may know, during the years when the crowns of Spain and Portugal were united, between 1580 and 1640, a number of prominent Portuguese merchants and bankers came to play a major role as bankers for the Spanish crown, and their activity was straddling both European finance and transatlantic trade. And the profits from the transatlantic trade, including African slaves, financing alone made it possible for them to secure a very important source of income, such as tax funds and monopolies, which in turn fostered their Atlantic trade. For them, apart from the ordinary risks of commerce, such specific risks could be mentioned as the fact that they were dependent upon the reversal of fortune in their relation with the Spanish crown, which happened in 1640, and of course under the constant threat of Spanish Inquisition. Depending on the outcome of the conflict, if we look now at the role of army purveyors could strike gold or even lose their shirt. The Lopez Soiseaux certainly seem to be in the first case, but not others. For instance, Joseph Cortissos. Joseph Cortissos was born in Antwerp in the middle of the 17th century and established himself in London as a banker. He's appointed an army purveyor and commissioner. He's appointed general purveyor of the Portuguese and British armies during the War of Spanish Succession in 1705 against France and its candidate to the Spanish throne, that is the grandson of Louis XIV. Unfortunately, Cortissos is on the wrong side of things, and he ends up ruined at the end of the war when he fails to obtain the repayment of the large loans he made to the British and Portuguese crown and spends years with legal procedures. Now, so army purveyors have their own kind of risky business. Francesca Trivellato, whose name I already mentioned, has told a fascinating story of a diamond deal. She calls it the big diamond affair, which unfolds between India, Eastern Mediterranean, Aleppo, Italy, Livorno, Western Europe. It involved a 60-carat diamond, Indian trader, Persian Jews, Livorno Sephardi firm, Ergas and Silvera, involved in the coral diamond trade, as well as other Sephardi correspondents in Amsterdam, London, and other places. And she tells this fascinating story of the big diamond affair and shows that after 2 years of efforts and peddling across aristocratic Europe to find a buyer, well, this big diamond brings down the reputable and old firm of Ergas and Silvera because the diamond proved unsellable. So that is to discuss, as you understand, the myth of prosperity, Sephardi prosperity, and embarrassment of riches that is usually associated with them. Now, if we look at the lengthy, very complex process of transactions involved in colonial exchange, it appears that risk is present at every single stage of that process. The first stage for colonial exchange is to collect a variety of commodities, a wide range of provisions and manufacture for the outbound trade. These can be collected locally or brought in from farther away. So, this stage implied multiple suppliers, and with each supplier the risk of having low-quality products or damaged goods. If we look, for instance, at a shipment bound for Jamaica from London, we find textile, hats, books, cheese, wine. In colonial trade, that is a very important issue. Long-distance trade is always connected and articulated, indebted to local economy, which supplies a large part of this outbound cargo. For instance, a favorite commodity for the Bordeaux colonial trade is the dried prunes, which are a specialty of the area, or naturally the wines. So there is this connection, interesting connection, this Sephardi trade and networks between very local and very far away international trade. Now, so collecting the cargo. Then the cargo was entrusted to the ship captain. It was to be trusted to make the long transatlantic voyage. On arrival, you had an agent who collected the consignment and was charged with selling the goods at the best possible price and not cheating on the return consignment. Naturally, once back in London, in this example, colonial goods had to be sold to merchants and brokers with a good credit reputation. Provided piracy, fire, embezzlement, rats, war were avoided, the whole process extended well over a year, sometimes 2 or 3. Now, you will see where this is leading. The routes that these merchandise follow are sometimes surprising, in part because of the importance of contraband trade in the Caribbean area in particular, and of piracy, whether it is state-sponsored or not. In 1756, David Gradis of Bordeaux, who is in the process of collecting cargo to send to the New World, is informed by his nephew, who is in Bayonne, that several ships seized by the French have arrived, by French corsairs, have arrived, and among these ships there was one that was seized on his way to Carolina, and the cargo of that ship is to be auctioned. So he's particularly interested in a large shipment of shoes with a double sole. I don't exactly know what it means, double sole. And he keeps nagging his nephew who's in Bayonne to go and look at the shoes and estimate their quality, and he wants to buy between 4,000 and 8,000 pairs of shoes. Now he's very anxious about the delay in the auction. It doesn't take place, and he misses his deal because he wanted to. His project was to put those shoes on the ship that was bound for Spanish America. So here, risky business, the responsibility of collecting this cargo, and the fact that time is of the essence. Time and opportunity are of the essence. And in this case, they do not match. The auction happens too late, therefore he doesn't buy as many pairs of shoes as he had wanted to. So, given the high risk of colonial trade, it is not surprising that while a rather large number of Sephardic participated, a few of them made huge fortunes, few lasted and flourished in this trade. Now, if we look at the organization of early modern commerce, and this has appeared in this description I gave you of the collection of the outbound cargo, a salient feature that makes it very different from contemporary trade is the fact that it is mostly organized not around a product, but around a route or a circuit. And that merchant will buy and sell whatever may be profitable on that route and circuit. Now, of course, there are some exceptions, like the diamond trade, and also the fact that in the 18th century, new forms of organization are more product-centered. But this is the idea that we should keep in mind. Trade organized along a route or a circuit. And I will illustrate this characteristic feature of early modern trade and Sephardic trade with another example from a lesser-known route of that trade, the trade between Amsterdam and Morocco. Well, it just happens that there was another ship that was seized, this time by the British in the Mediterranean, and on that ship there was a bundle of letters from Amsterdam to Jews in Salé. And obviously this kind of find in the archives is very interesting. We also have commercial correspondence, of course sent by merchants, but it's very different because it's a copy, either letters the merchant received or copies of the letter they sent. Here, with such chance encounters, we have the whole set of letters being sent from one group to another. Even letters that have nothing to do with business and unimportant letters that were not going to be kept in commercial correspondence. So, I want to use that to give you an example of that trade between Amsterdam and Barbary Coast. This trade relation between Amsterdam and Morocco, particularly the town of Salé, which is now connected with the Rabat, the capital of Morocco, and it's the same town, just this river, but obviously people who know Morocco, happens to be where my family comes from. If my mother heard me say that Rabat and Salé are the same thing, she would not like this at all, because they're two very different traditions and competition between the Jews of Rabat and Salé. But anyway, let us say that Salé and Rabat are very close today, just separated by a river, just to let you know where Salé actually is. So what goes on between those two cities? A simple description of that trade would show cargoes sent from Amsterdam, composed mostly of arms, munitions, naval stores, timber, nails, textiles, and other commodities, where the return cargo would carry wool, saltpeter, almonds, wax, dates, hides, and feathers and other things. But in fact, this simple pattern is very often more complicated, because on the return leg of the journey, the ship often stops to load and unload in Italy, Livorno, various commodities, as well as gold or silver bullion, much in demand in Livorno. And sometimes it does that, so too on the way to Morocco. So, as well, it is not that simple because many circuits can interconnect with one another or several other circuits for the supply of the commodities sent to Salé. For instance, in some of the merchandise that I see circulating, there are iron bars coming from the Biscay region of Spain. So these iron, which has a specialty of excellent iron from Spain, were first sent, obviously, from Spain to Amsterdam through different possible ways, and then from Amsterdam back to the Mediterranean and to Salé. The same with timber and naval stores, which very often come from the Baltic. So the connection with the Baltic trade, or with connection with Atlantic trade with the shipment of dyestuffs that I found very often. Here again, the routes may seem contorted. I found several shipments of coral from Amsterdam to Salé, and obviously the coral gets to Amsterdam from Livorno. So it first goes to Livorno, Amsterdam, and then it's shipped back to Salé, to the Barbary Coast, to be then sold for the African trade. But the most salient feature of that trade between Salé and Amsterdam is that it was in large part fostered by Mediterranean piracy. Portuguese Jews bought the high-value merchandise captured by independent or state-sponsored pirates, sold in Salé, which was then re-exported to Northern Europe for resale. Last item in that trade, the question of captives, the ransom of captives. Christian captives, very often Dutch captives, and of course Jewish captives, but the whole issue of Jewish captives is a totally different question, which maybe we can, I can add a few things if you're interested in the discussion. So we have, between Amsterdam and Salé, a sort of three-tiered system, what I could call ordinary staple trade, piracy-related trade, and the more complex business of the ransom of captives. Now, I said organization along a route with a few complexities. A notable exception to this idea of the organization of trade along a route is the diamond and coral trade, which I already mentioned. The diamond and coral trade is the best example of a far-reaching, complex trading system in which several networks operating on different geographical areas connect. Until the 1730s, rough uncut diamond came primarily from India, first from Goa, the Portuguese possession in India, and then from the British settlements in Madras. And then it started coming also from Brazil. Now coral, which was fished in the Mediterranean and the Italian coast, Sardinia, was much in demand in India, and it was the main commodity, together with silver and other precious stone, that was exported to India for that trade, coral in exchange for diamonds. The Portuguese Jews of Livorno bought Mediterranean coral, transformed it in Livorno, and then sent it to India through their agents in London and in Lisbon. The uncut diamonds were sent to London on ships from the East India Company, or smuggled. Now the diamond importers were mostly Sephardic Jews in London, like the Franco, for instance, and the diamonds were sent, the uncut rough diamonds were sent to Amsterdam, where they were cut and polished, and then sent back to London, where the nobility and court society constituted likely customers. One more element to that picture is the fact that network, which I have described until now around Mediterranean Asia, was also connected with the Atlantic trade, in the fact that silver was one of the products that was being exported to India. And prominent Sephardi merchants in London, for instance, were important importers of silver smuggled from Spanish America to the Caribbean. So the coral and diamond trade, as you see, was not operated through one network, but through the interconnection of a series of sub-networks, which constituted as many links that's a picture that spanned over an enormous space from India to the Caribbean. And in order to present a complete picture of that trade, as Francesca Trivellato has shown, this Sephardi network interconnected with other non-Jewish networks, Italians in Lisbon for the trade that went through Lisbon, and Hindus in Goa. And she gives us, making that demonstration, a wonderful case analysis of cross-cultural networks and trade. Cross-cultural trade, that is, trade cooperation between merchants belonging to different groups and communities. So, we come to that question, who did these Sephardi merchants trade with? Well, it's easy and not easy to answer that question. There is a great diversity in the commercial literature, I mean, the correspondence and the archives I have been working on. It really depends on the kind of trade. Very often what I can say is that the core partners were very often Sephardi Jews. This merchant, Isaac Orobio de Castro, who dealt mostly between the colonial trade between Amsterdam and the Caribbean, he had mostly Sephardi partners and a few non-Jewish partners in other places, mostly Spain, Paris, and other such European places. Now, there is another important element, which is that there was the circulation of merchandise and also credit. And naturally, partners for credit were very often, since it involved the exchange, the bills of exchange circulating to a number of European places, much more often non-Jewish partners, non-Sephardi partners, than regular cooperation. But there was no impossibility to cross-cultural trade. Let's say that very often the main partners remained Sephardi Jews. And there was this question about cooperation between the Sephardi and Ashkenazi traders. The only instance where this appears very clearly is the diamond trade, because in the diamond trade, Ashkenazi Jews were very important, became prominent at the end of the 18th century in London, and they had a few Sephardi partners. But it is not that common to see Ashkenaz and Sephardi Jews cooperate in that matter or other matters, as a matter of fact, in that period, during that period. Now, if we go back to that falsely simple model of the route or the circuit trade, then several questions arise as to how that trade was conducted. Did the merchants travel with their wares, for instance? It seems like an elementary question, because the idea of trade is a priori associated with merchant mobility. Let us say that if in the 16th century merchants still are rather mobile, merchants become more sedentary as time goes and rely more and more on factors and correspondence. Now, it also depends on the kind of business, on the level of the merchant and the age of the merchant. For instance, such trades as the diamond trade still involved a lot of traveling. More established merchants traveled less, younger ones more. But it must be said that Portuguese merchants certainly traveled more than their non-Jewish counterparts. Because trade is only one of the multiple series of factors that fostered Jewish mobility, including the mobility of the merchants themselves. The dispersion of close kin over vast maritime expenses, in the case of the Portuguese, being another major factor of that mobility. But here, economic strategy and family mobility interact in a complex and often self-perpetuating cycle. An exception to that idea that the merchants don't travel very often is the example of a Portuguese trader from the Suriname community in the Dutch Guianas, Rafael Fernandes, who crosses the Atlantic between Suriname and Amsterdam every few years. And we have the cargo of his return trip to Suriname for one of his trips. He brings along a cargo containing several dozen blankets, 300 pairs of shoes, 66 mirrors, 87 French handkerchiefs, 71 pairs of stockings, smoking pipes, nails, 450 pots, Dutch gin, etc., as well as more idiosyncratic commodities such as matzot, unleavened bread for Pesach, for Passover, spice boxes for the end of Shabbat, and prayer books. But of course, his mobility can be interpreted as the reflection of the sedentarity of those who stayed in Suriname and gave him powers of attorney to act on behalf of them as in commercial matters. So most merchants do not travel regularly, And considering the distances involved in transport and communication in this maritime diaspora, they consequently need to work through agents, either permanent factors or commissioners, at any rate correspondents who they can trust and entrust with decision-making on very important questions such as quality control, buying or selling at the right price. The idea of trust, which I have alluded to a number of times, is a very important one. I did find a Portuguese merchant working with, from Amsterdam, between Amsterdam, the Caribbean and Smyrna, the Levant, with samples. He works with samples, but this is still rather unusual. And in his correspondence, there are still booklets with the samples of the textiles sent from Smyrna, and says a lot about the potency of 18th century dye stuff. The colors are very bright and well. But it was much more common to rely on partners, correspondence agents for the decision-making process. Now, it is very well known that these Sephardic Jews favored kinsmen as business partners and correspondents, and that kin-based networks as a solution for this acute question of reliability were often the solution that was adopted. Kinship and commerce are inseparable terms when dealing with the history of the Sephardim. But what exactly does that association between kinship and commerce mean? First, many of these merchant firms are based on family, are family-based, sometimes with formal contracts and sometimes, most of the time, not. For instance, the Castro family, that is in the diamond trade, provide a good example of the sibling network organized around the diamond trade. The father, Salomon de Castro, had been importing small quantities of diamonds from Madras in England in the 1720s, but it's his children, his sons, that became major actors in the diamond trade and coral trade in the 1740s due to the voluntary dispatching and relocation of family members in the various places central to this diamond coral trade. Isaac settles in Livorno, from where he ships coral to his brother David in London. The coral then goes to Madras, where Samuel is settled, and Samuel sends the uncut diamond to Jacob in Amsterdam, where they cut, polish, and before they send back to London, as I said. Now, that perfect-looking machine doesn't last for over more than a generation, and it collapses after this generation of brothers disappear. Now, many more examples of Sephardi family firms may be conjured up, but into the easy demonstration of the forcefulness of the link between kinship and commerce. Diego Gradis, the Gradis family I mentioned already, establishes a formal partnership with his three sons in Porto at the end of the 18th century. But here again, in order to go from cliché to history, we must take into account the various factors and criteria that interact in the choice or the elimination of kin as business partners. The evaluation of skills, reliability, trustworthiness, assessment of credit risk play a crucial role in the choice of these partners, kin or not kin. In the introductory example, the Musada character is literally discredited and eliminated for good because he has not a good credit, despite the fact that he's family. He is disreputable and owes money to the whole world. So, as well, there was another process. I mean that kin was not this association, easy association between kin and commerce is not always as automatic as it has been said to be. As well, before sons and nephews were introduced into the business, they very often went through a screening process, a process of apprenticeship, often under the supervision of a business partner in a foreign place. It is at the same time a form of professional training and a trial. For instance, David Gradis plans a very elaborate traveling apprenticeship for his son Abraham in the 1720s, which takes him to several business partners in London, Amsterdam, and Paris, both kin and non-kin, Jewish and non-Jewish. Abraham is not only expected to learn languages and observe mercantile customs, he's also expected to practice, with a specific budget allotted by his father for his trade games, as we may call them. One of his exercises is to sell a number of bales of sugar and to buy a list of detailed items for colonial trade, even at a loss. So, in order to derive first-hand knowledge of the tricks of the colonial trade. Obviously satisfied with his son's performance in all these exercises, After his sons return to Bordeaux, David Gradis allows him to conduct his own business. So, screened him before he associated him to the business. Sometimes business training among Portuguese can provide an opportunity for a good match. Samuel Peixoto, another Portuguese Jew from Bordeaux, the son of a well-to-do banker, sets out on a traveling apprenticeship to Amsterdam and London, with his uncle as a chaperone. He chances upon a very good match in London and marries off a Mendes da Costa daughter, which is about the best we do at the time, Sarah, with a very nice dowry. Now, this is only the beginning of what will be the most famous Portuguese matrimonial cause célèbre in France because of his lengthy, very long divorce proceedings and his extravagant character of that guy. He wants to divorce his wife, he uses Jewish law, French law, in the end he converts to get rid of her, and chooses the King of Spain as his godfather. And his fame is such that he even becomes the hero of a semi-serious, semi-pornographic, tale. I can give you a Pilanza de Robert, 10 volumes of its political criticism, but with pornographic angle. Last but not least, marriage played a major part in this kinship commerce nexus. But here again, we have to be cautious about of making simplistic analysis. The marriage pattern of the Gradis family, which has been analyzed by Richard Menkes in his PhD, offers a very clear example of what I mean here. Diego Gradis that I mentioned surfaces in Bordeaux at the end of the 17th century. He has 3 sons. His 3 sons marry the 3 daughters of Mendes Moreno family of Toulouse, very well endowed daughters. 2 of these weddings take place on the same day. Now, at the beginning of the 18th century, several more marriages are contracted with 3 important families that will give interesting connections to the Gradis. One in Bayonne, one has connection to the French West Indies, and one in Amsterdam. Now, so we have this stage of expansion. In the 1730s, David Gradis marries 2 of his children to the children of his brother in exchange of first cousins, cross marriage between first cousins. Thereafter follows a series of intra-family close kin marriages within the small cluster of this allied family. In other words, marriage is first used to extend the firm's capital, the dowries, and its connection potential, and then serves to keep it within the cluster of these several firms. Marrying outside the family and in the family serve the double strategy of expansion, consolidation, preservation of the firm's capital. This pattern of matrimonial alliance between merchant families followed by strict endogamy within the cluster thus defined is to be found among many Portuguese business clusters. What is very unique? So, now, this question of marriage alliances between important business traders and merchants, is that unique to Sephardic Jews? No, it's not unique. What is very unique to this group is the prominent original places of several kinds of marriage. Marriage between first cousins and marriage between uncle and niece. I could present the amazing intra-family endogamy of the Mendes da Costa family of London and Amsterdam over several generations, in which the pattern of marriage between first cousin and with nieces is repeated constantly. I won't go into that, just trust me. It's amazing. Well, just one generation. 2 brothers, Fernão, Alvaro. Alvaro has 9 children, out of which 6 marry other da Costa, 3 first cousins, and his brother has 6 children, 1 doesn't marry, the other 5 all marry da Costas, among which the 3 that marry their first cousins. And it's repeated the next generation so that everybody has a set name. Now, I think that this pattern of close marriage is a definite Portuguese idiosyncrasy, and it's very often interpreted in the context of economic strategies, but I think it has a meaning that goes much beyond the sphere of economic strategies. In his Compendium of Laws and Customs, 17th century, the Rabbi Menashe ben Israel devotes a whole section to matrimony, and he lists the forbidden marriages as they are exposed in the Torah, but also marriages are particularly commendable. And he says, first, the marriage between first cousins, he says it's a welcome matrimony because it is in the same descendants and it was celebrated by Jacob. Remember, Jacob married two of his first cousins. What he says about the marriage between uncle and niece is even more laudatory. He says it's a mitzvah for an uncle to marry his niece. Two Portuguese Jews from Amsterdam, husband and wife, while writing their testaments in the 1750s, write the following thing in their testament. They list their pious legacy and they say about their legatees. In case of marrying, they please to follow the example of their ancestors as much as is feasible to them, their children marrying amongst one another, and then Germains with Germains, so that the race of Pinto be multiplied, if it is not contrary to their inclination. In a nutshell, I think that this form of marriage should be interpreted also in their broader, not only the context of business, firms, and networks, but also in their broader relation where Sephardim is concerned with lineage, purity of blood, self-representation, and distinctive ethnicity, and not simply as business strategy. The originality of this close-kin marriage appears even with greater clarity when compared to another very famous tale of kinship and commerce, the story written by Glückelhammen at the end of the 17th century in her memoirs. Glückelhammen is a very strong-headed German Jewish businesswoman whose primary concern is to provide a good match for her children, preserve her business, and live righteously. If we look at the marriage patterns between her 11 children, between her siblings and her husband's siblings, only one of these marriages is between close kin. Now, I'm insisting on some specific aspects of these Portuguese networks, but I wouldn't want you to mislead you into believing that they are unique in all things. These networks share several of the above-mentioned features with other trading or confessional diaspora. First and foremost, they could be compared to the diaspora of the French Huguenots, also initiated by persecution, their expulsion from France by Louis XIV. Protestant merchants in Bordeaux are also largely engaged in business and cooperation and marriage with Protestant partners established in Amsterdam, London, Switzerland. A study on the brandy trades shows that Huguenot networks in southwestern France, Ireland, Amsterdam, London show very striking similarities with the networks I have described and the link between kinship and commerce. Similarly, studies on Italian merchants in early modern London emphasize the role of family in the organization of trade and trade networks. Another diaspora that could offer very welcome point of comparison is the Armenian Diaspora, which offers also a number of striking similarities with the Portuguese. It covers vast expanses, and like the Portuguese diaspora, it is a stateless diaspora. And it could be argued that it also developed some form of social and religious cohesiveness comparable to that of the Portuguese network of communities. Then what differentiates this Sephardi diaspora and its trading network? Its originality lies, I think, in a number of general and specific features. Some of these features may be truly distinctive, like close-kin marriage, others shared with other groups, but it is the combination that bespeaks the originality of this diaspora. Which features, very quickly, its longevity, its extension and expansion of the space. As we saw, it's involved in the most important empire history of the most important empires of the early modern period. No other diaspora managed to span religious divides in the same extensive manner. Islam, Catholic world, Protestantism. But most of all, what makes it specific, I think, is the idea of interconnectedness. The potential for articulation between numerous distinct networks, as was illustrated in the case of the coral and diamond trade. That interconnected Caribbean, North European, Mediterranean, and Asian networks. Finally, and this is, I will end with this, the history, I think this is a very important point, the history of these trading networks cannot be isolated from the history of the diaspora. They overlap with and are part of a comprehensive system of circulation and communication in which individuals, families, communities, and other institutions interact, resorting to all available resources for bridging the specific problems of a dispersed, distant, and yet closely connected and related diaspora. This interconnection and interaction between the various spheres can be best understood through examples. I will just give you one. The dispersion of clotheskin over vast expenses for economic and non-economic reasons created sometimes situations that required the involvement of the communities. In 1754, for instance, the Amsterdam Portuguese community paid for the transportation of a childless widow to Suriname, where, with the help of the local Portuguese community, she succeeding after 2 years' effort at locating her brother-in-law, who was supposed to either marry her, the levirate marriage, or free her by the ceremony of the Khalitsa. The guy was roaming around the Caribbean, and so it took some trouble before they could locate him and free her. Similarly, London community pays for the trip, for a levirate marriage trip, also a Khalitsa, between London and Smyrna. Information about families, complex inheritance situations also circulate via intercommunal relations. And very often, individuals' families turn to the communities to take care of some. Sometimes we go into that involvement of the communities in business questions, but at least, certainly the transmission of estates is something that is very often entrusted to the communities by individuals and family. For very important estates and for also a very modest one. As you might have noticed, I have a soft spot for the lesser known, the less affluent of these merchants. And so I will end this long talk with another sketch of an ordinary 18th century small-scale trader. In 1764, Abraham Alvarez, otherwise totally unknown to me, is about to embark on a commercial trip to Jamaica from London. Before doing so, he lists an inventory of all his possessions and debts, which he leaves with another Portuguese merchant, Rafael Vaz de Silva, in London. In the case that during his trip, he dies, and then, if that happens, he wants his papers and and his estate to be transmitted to the Amsterdam Board of Parnassim, the governing board of the Portuguese communities, that they would take care of his estate. So what does he possess? He has a bit of money invested in Amsterdam and with a Paris banker, Le Couteau, which is also the financial correspondent of the Portuguese community in Paris, because the Portuguese community has important funds invested in Paris and London, so on. And he has various wares in Amsterdam with this person, some in Jamaica with that person, some in Curaçao with that other person, and a box with books in various places. We also know what he takes with him on the trip, such items as his cooking utensils for the trip. Obviously, he needs them to keep kosher. Well, he does that trip. Actually, on the Spanish coast of America, probably while smuggling goods through the Caribbean. So, that is why we know about him. This Sephardi friend in London forwards his papers and his relatively modest estate, scattered diasporic estate, to the Amsterdam Parnassim, and that's how I found those papers. Now, another instance of the involvement of the community is when Portuguese Jews are captured by Spanish ships, either in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, under a variety of circumstances. But the most common is Caribbean smuggling. And very often, and when Portuguese Jews are captured by Spanish, they're taken to Spain, imprisoned, and as Portuguese, potential new Christians, that is, potential heretics, they face charges of heresy from the Inquisition. We have many such cases that can be found in the correspondence between the communities and also private correspondences. And each time, networks are activated to solve these cases. Networks of diplomatic intervention, generally channeled through the States General of Holland, and with the contact of the ambassador of Madrid in The Hague and the ambassador of the States General in Madrid. Networks that also involve the various Portuguese communities, and when they're brought to Spain, very often they're brought in San Sebastian. Then it's the Bayonne Portuguese community that's going to get in touch with their commercial, their business partners in San Sebastian, with whom they have very frequent contact, to keep in touch with these prisoners, send them food, even information, and transmit letters about their situation. So here you see merchant connection, community connection, diplomatic networks interacting. This diaspora is crisscrossed by numerous routes and circuits which delineate networks of varying nature and permanence, the combination of which convey the image of a people in communication, characterized by intensive circulation of people, information, institutions, things, all kinds of things. Not only merchandise and letters, but books, but also what I call the choses du sacré, observance-related items that I see circulate, Torah scroll and the whole gamut of Torah and synagogue ornaments, kosher foods, wine, meat, cheese, specific liturgical items like citruses, etrogim, and death-related items, bodies, tombstones, bones, caskets of soil from the Holy Land. These sacred paraphernalia, the circulation is really, I think, very interesting. You can reconstruct Sephardic network also through the circulation of these things. For instance, how the soil, the land from the Holy Land, how it reaches from the Holy Land to the Caribbean. And it's not the same route, whether it's sent through the Dutch or the British circuits. Well, so, myth and reality, Jews and commerce, a trading diaspora, yes, not wholly unique, not wholly similar to other trading diaspora. But this diaspora cannot be understood without reference to its extreme social diversity and also in isolation, isolating the merchant networks only. But it has to be embedded in the global history of communication and circulation in the diaspora and the Jewish world at large. I spoke for a long time.
Thank you so much for quite a remarkable lecture. So much information and so many goods and merchandise. We are running a little late, so we're just going to make a few questions and comments. I will protect our speaker again as I did last week, or I'll try. So just a couple of questions, and please try to make them brief. Go on.
Yeah,
Back.
I hope this
Loud.
Okay, I hope this isn't an irrelevant question. Can you comment on the role of North African Jews in facilitating the payment of ransom on behalf of European countries and the United States to Barbary pirates for captured ships and sailors?
Actually, there were a number of organizations for the ransom of captives in the Mediterranean, most of them Christian. The involvement of it's mostly the Sephardi Jews from Saleh, the ones that are connected with Amsterdam, that are active together with the Jews from Amsterdam in the redemption of these Dutch merchants. Now, there is also, of course, the very important question of the redemption of Jewish captives, but that's not what you're asking about, is it? No, in connection with the American, no, I don't think I can, I don't know precisely whether they played a role in that. I don't think so. I haven't seen anything to that effect.
Yes.
Can you quantify this? Can you quantify the size of these operations in current dollars? Were they $1 million or $100,000 or $10 million?
It's very difficult to come to. I wish I could. Believe me, I can't. Because first of all, I'm very dependent on the kind of sources I have. For instance, in some cases I have only some correspondence of the merchant. In order to be able to reconstruct that, you need the account books, the ledgers of these merchants to be able to evaluate. What I can say in terms of proportion is that there are a few commodities in which Jews were definitely important, such as tobacco. Even Jews and converses very important monopoly of tobacco, legal and smuggling, and contraband trade, sugar and coffee. They were definitely, and diamond. I would say these are the commodities where their economic contribution was really prominent. Now, more than that, it's a little difficult to assert.
Yes.
It seems, from what I interpreted and understood in your lecture, was that the Sephardic trade was an important part of world commerce. Is that correct? The Sephardic were the leaders of a lot of these different trading of goods. Is that accurate?
I wouldn't say it like that. I would say that they played a very important role for certain kind of trades. Unfortunately, for instance, for the, as Jessica Hoffman knows better than I do, the Iberian slave trade. Yeah, they were instrumental because of this interconnectedness and because the financial role they played at the Spanish court. The first, not the later stage of slave trade where they played a very minor role. They were also instrumental in the organization of the sugar trade, definitely, between the Azores, Brazil, because of the Dutch presence in Brazil between the years 1630 and 1654. Of course, I'm speaking of Sephardic Jews, but you should magnify their contribution to the point of leading. And also the diamonds, I said, the diamonds were definitely prominent in the diamond trade.
Last question, right over here. Yes, young lady.
So we have some Jewish settlements. We have some Jewish settlements in India. They live in Cochin, and Cochin is where I know they are there. Were these established back in the 17th or 16th century, or did they come about much later?
The Jews of Cochin, you have several layers to that history. Some are there since the Middle Ages, and there were some Sephardi merchants settling there in the 16th century. But and some Portuguese traders go there, but they're not really early modern. The Jews in India are mostly settled in Madras. They're from England, and these are Jews from the Sephardic diaspora that I mentioned. But the Cochin Jew, they go back to a much older history.
I want to thank Evelyne for a scintillating lecture, and based, as you see, on our own original research. Please come back next week on Wednesday to hear the Ashkenazic side of the story. We've heard the Sephardic tonight. Thank you very much for coming.